If you're here, oh, there's Peter Beinart, terrifically on time. That's wonderful. Hello, everybody. I'm Peter Larson with the Ottawa Forum in Israel-Palestine. We're glad that you're with us tonight, and I am just thrilled to have Peter Beinart on with us tonight for a little bit of time to shed some of his knowledge and experience. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Peter, we're broadcasting here from Ottawa in Indigenous territory, Algonquin territory. I know you've been here at least once because I saw you at speaking at a synagogue here in Ottawa, and I remember at the time, this must have been back 7 or 8 years ago, Peter. I can't remember how long, and I was shocked really because most of my Jewish friends here tend to be on the secular side, and your Jewishness was very much in evidence, and I was delighted by it. So it's been a great pleasure of mine to follow you and your writing over time. So we're just thrilled to have you, Peter.
Thank you.
We had invited you originally. I invited you. I didn't make an apology. When I set this up, it hadn't occurred to me that this was in Passover. So if we've disrupted any of your family activities, I'm sorry.
No. You haven't. We're doing the first 2 nights have ended, so this is the intermediate period, which is not really a holiday, so it's totally fine. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. So, Peter, when we talked, this was going back about a month ago, I had asked you if you would share some of your insight on as a Jew and as a Jew whose family comes from South Africa, some insight on the South African submission to the International Court of Justice, why you think it was happening, its significance, and so on. And you agreed to do that, and that's terrific. And that's what I invited people to come to listen to you about. But in the interim, this week there have been extraordinary developments in New York, where you are. I think you're in New York. I know you normally are in New York.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
At Columbia University and now other universities across the state. Across the U.S., there have been these tent cities that have sprung up. There have been repression or police intervention, and then that's created more reaction. Now President Biden has come out and denounced these students for being anti-Semitic and so on. And so I'd like to spend the first couple of minutes just getting your perspective on what you think is going on and how significant it is.
Sure. And thanks for having me. I thought I would just take maybe I'll put a link to my newsletter in the chat if anyone is interested. I know we're grateful to have you as a subscriber. I think these are very significant. I mean, in some ways we're kind of in the eye of the storm right now, so it's always hard to gauge the longer term impact. But I think what the protests of the last few days confirm, which I think the whole last 6 months has suggested, is that that this movement for Palestinian freedom is becoming a kind of defining element of politics for young American progressives, kind of their equivalent of what the Occupy movement was a decade ago, what the anti-apartheid movement was, what the anti-Vietnam War movement was. So I think that's enormously significant because if you look at American history, I think you tend to find that even though these movements may erupt for a moment and then appear to die down, they actually they move through American institutions. So that the institution that they're now convulsing is universities, just as the anti-war movement convulsed universities in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. But probably these students, because the question of the rights of Palestinians is becoming central to their politics, they will reshape other American institutions, and I think over time may well reshape the Democratic Party.
Do you think what I see, some of the discussion now, Peter, is quite a bit around freedom of speech, what they're allowed to do and so on. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does that spread the debate, or is that recenter the debate away from the initial impetus of focusing on Gaza and Columbia and university complicity? Is this a good development or a bad development?
Um, I mean, I think that it's true that a lot of the coverage in the US has not focused particularly on the demands of the students, but focused on the impact that they're having on Jewish students on campus or on life in campus more generally, or kind of the conflicts they're having with university administrations. But I think that the question of free speech is actually important because one of the ways in which I think a critical way in which people in various different positions of power try to prevent this shift in public opinion among young Americans from changing American foreign policy on this issue will be to limit their rights of free speech. So the two issues are, I think, intertwined. We've seen these in various ways over the years, whether it's with laws that prevent people who support boycotting Israel from being employed by state governments, for instance. And you now see, and I think this will probably increase even now, that there's a serious push from members of Congress to try to punish universities and force them to restrict the free speech of their students. And they're doing this because they see what's happening at those universities as a threat to US policy towards Israel, but also actually as a threat to their kind of vision of the America that they want.
We can't really speculate what's going to happen in the short run, but do you think this is going to change the American discourse about freedom of speech and about foreign policy in a longer term sense? Well, I can't help but hope that Israel will come out damaged in this, but I see that in the short run, the forces of repression seem to be quite strong.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't. For myself, I don't. For me, the goal would not be to see Israel damaged, but to see Israel forced to reckon with the consequences of its oppression of Palestinians in a way that makes Israelis realize they need to take a different path, a fundamental different path, not just ending the war, but ultimately a kind of a path away from the kind of group supremacy that exists in Israel-Palestine today. I still think we're very long way away from those kind of changes in US policy, but you can see more movement in the last 6 months than we have seen probably in decades. So the number of Democrats who are now supporting some form of conditioning military aid has increased pretty dramatically. It's still probably a minority of the Democrats in Congress, but it's a live issue now. I mean, I think one intriguing analogy, these historical analogies are always flawed, but just to think about the way things could play out would be to think about the anti-war protests in 1968 when they convulsed American campuses, they convulsed the Democratic Convention, the Democratic Party tore itself apart. Hubert Humphrey, who in some ways has a lot in common with Joe Biden, Humphrey being Johnson's vice president, who was a kind of domestic liberal but very hawkish on foreign policy, lost to Richard Nixon. But then in 1972, the Democrats nominated George McGovern, who would never have been the nominee had not the anti-war movement actually really made real inroads into the Democratic Party. Then he still lost. He got killed in 1972 by Richard Nixon. But by 1974, the Democrats had enough influence in Congress and some progressive Republicans to end the war in Vietnam. So I think if you look at the way American politics on Vietnam plays from 1968 to 1974, you can see lots of kind of ups and downs and victories and defeat. But you can actually see, if you look at the whole thing, the trajectory of a movement that ultimately ends a war earlier than it would have otherwise ended. And so maybe with lots of fits and starts and potentially with the election of Donald Trump, which will be a disaster, I still think in the longer term, when we look back at it decades from now, we may see that this movement is changing the trajectory of US policy.
Peter, I can't help but smile. I lived through those times. You didn't. You're too
That's
young,
true.
and you have a much clearer memory of it than I do. So
I don't know about that,
so good for you, Peter. Have you been to the demonstration at Columbia or any of the other ones, sort of got a sense of the pulse of it?
It's funny, I haven't, because I just got back to New York from Boston, where I was for the first days of Passover. I have been quite a number of campuses from since October 7th, Brown, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, quite a few others, but they were all before this broke out. So since this broke out, I've been in communication with some students at Columbia, but I haven't actually been up there yet.
And what's your sense? We're a long ways away from it in Canada. I don't even have a sense of the geography of New York, but what about this charge that there is significant anti-Semitic kind of content to it? Is this a 1%, a 20%? How do you see it?
I mean, it's very hard to kind of gauge these things. I think that from what I hear from people, most of the anti-Semitic comments that people have recorded have been reported, and there certainly have been. There have been some. They seem to be coming less from the students. So what happened is that Columbia now, like a lot of other universities, has basically locked down the campus. So you can't get in. It used to be that you could walk from the Broadway, right through into campus. Basically, they've locked down the campus. So, but you have a lot of protests that are happening outside the campus, outside the gates of the campus. And it seems from the reporting that I've seen that the more of these incidents that appear to be anti-Semitic are happening outside the campus from people protesting who may not be students at all. We don't even really know where they're coming from. And there's less of that. There's less of that that's actually happening among the students themselves. And the student encampment has, as is true on a lot of these campuses, has a Jewish presence. Actually, I think a significant Jewish presence. They had Shabbat services there on Friday night. They had a Seder. So I think that, it's worth remembering that movements, that as they grow, attract all kinds of people. And they don't always attract people whose vision and whose ethics are the same as there were people in the anti-war movement who wanted to end the war, and then there were people who wanted to fly North Vietnamese flags, right? Those people were offering very different visions, I think, of what the movement was about. So I think that there are clearly some people who've become somehow engaged in this who are saying things that I think are deplorable. But I think the core demands of the movement from the students, which are ending the war and some form of divestment from Israel or from the Israeli military, I think there's nothing anti-Semitic about that, certainly.
Peter, we're going to, first I should remind people, if you want to ask questions of Peter, we will reserve some time for Q&A afterwards rather than interjecting now. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and my colleague Grafton Ross is in the background. He will be watching the questions and trying to bunch them together or put them to Peter, not necessarily in the order they come in, and maybe even not using the exact same words, but the issues you raise. So please use the Q&A function. The chat function is enabled, and I know from experience Peter's very good at looking at the chat while he also talks. So if you see something you want to respond to, Peter, feel free to do it. That's more bandwidth than I have, so that's fine. Maybe we'll turn now, Peter, to this issue of South Africa and the International Court of Justice, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I'd like, if you won't mind, I'd like to start off with you sharing with us a little bit of your personal history, because I think I know some of it, but not very much. And then maybe, I hope there are people on this call tonight who don't know you at all. So if they all know you and know you as well as I do, then we're sort of wasting our time. But I'm hoping there are people who don't. So tell us a little bit about where your family comes from and who you are.
Sure. So my parents were South African immigrants to the United States. They were both from Cape Town. Both of their parents had immigrated. My father's family are Lithuanian Jews who immigrated to South Africa, which is very, very typical. Most South African Jews are from Lithuanian descent. My mother's family on her mother's side is more unusual. Her grandmother was born in Alexandria in Egypt. And the family before that comes from the Ottoman Empire, from the Isle of Rhodes in what's now Greece and Izmir, and now Turkey. And she went to the Belgian Congo, of all places, and then to South Africa. They got married they met at the University of Cape Town, got married, moved to the United States in 1970, just before I was born, when my father became a professor at MIT. He moved from the University of Cape Town to MIT. I think, and I spent a fair amount of time in South Africa as a kid because my mother was very homesick. And so whenever she had the opportunity, she took us to be with her parents and her brother and sister. The entire family was still there. I think that so South Africa had a pretty formative impact on my sister and me in complicated ways. On the one hand, it was a place that we both really loved because we didn't really have any family in the United States, so that was where all of our extended family was. And South Africa is a really beautiful country, and its Jewish community was one that I felt and still do feel very, very connected to. On the other hand, as I began to get a little bit older, I kind of began to realize that this community, this family that I was very, very connected to, was kind of enmeshed in this really grotesque kind of system of oppression based on race. And I think that to me, as I struggle to make sense of that, the fact that the anti-apartheid movement was a movement that brought together Black South Africans, Indian South Africans, South Africans who were who were under that designation termed colored, and Jewish South Africans, often South African Jews in quite prominent places like Joe Slovo, who was the head of the South African Communist Party, the head of the military wing of the ANC, was something that was for me something that meant a lot to me. And I think that I think that since I spent a lot of time as a child in environments where people were finding ways of justifying a system of oppression that in retrospect looks completely unjustifiable. Oftentimes the debates about Israel and Palestine remind me of those conversations that I was part of as a child about apartheid South Africa. And I often think about what it took to end apartheid in South Africa and what are the potential building blocks that exist in Israel-Palestine and what are the differences.
I think I remember you telling me, or maybe in one of your seminars, that the Jewish community in South Africa was itself divided. There were some Jews who thought that their fate was better with the dominant group, and some like Joe Slovo who said, no, it's not the case. How did that play out with your family?
Yes, that's right. I mean, the South African Jewish community often had a bit of a distance from the South African Jewish community was very Zionist, and its mainstream, I think, kind of didn't have a nationalist identification with South Africa because South African nationalism was kind of Afrikaner nationalism. But they had found themselves in South Africa and felt that their safety was bound. I would say most South African Jews felt that they're like other white South Africans because they were treated as white, felt that their safety rested with the maintenance of this system of supremacy. They tended to be on the liberal side as white politics went, but still that was within a context that essentially accepted the foundations of apartheid. Then there was a kind of minority of South African Jews, mostly who were communists, who through their connection to the communist movement entered into the Black liberation struggle. So that someone like Joe Slovo would have been one of them. Ronnie Kasrils, who went on to become the first deputy defense minister, Albie Sachs, who was then on the Supreme Court after apartheid. A whole series of these people. They were a small percentage of South African Jews, but they were a quite large percentage of the whites who joined the anti-apartheid movement. Jews were very overrepresented in the Communist Party and very overrepresented among whites in the South African in the ANC, and I found that particular group of South African Jews who were quite alienated from the mainstream Jewish community. I mean, they literally had to go into exile or in prison, so they weren't living kind of normal. Ruth First, exactly, who was assassinated, Joe Slovo's wife. That to me they were fascinating figures because in some ways it's always struck me as really just an accident of history that they had ended up in South Africa in the first place. I mean, they certainly had no familial connection to Africa. Joe Slovo's first language was Yiddish, but through communism, they had an ideological perspective that allowed them to really identify with the Black South African struggle and to be willing to make really often quite heroic sacrifices. And through those sacrifices, I think they helped to build the ANC as a multiracial movement, because in the early years of the ANC moving towards embracing armed struggle under Mandela in the early 60s, before Mandela was put in jail, there were white South Africans who committed themselves to this struggle. Some had to go in exile, some were put in prison for long periods. And I think this built a sense of solidarity across racial lines, which proved to be really important in the way apartheid ultimately ended.
There's some, I can't help but think there's a certain parallel with the active involvement of a number of Jewish groups in North America, Colombia, and elsewhere. The fact that the participation of Jewish groups is extremely important in finding a voice and a vehicle to criticize Israel without being quickly targeted as anti-Semitic.
Yes, I think it's important tactically in the sense that it provides some kind of protection against charges of anti-Semitism. But I also think it's yes, it's very important. I think that and I think it's important for the message that it shows to the world, including to Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims, that this is not a tribal struggle. It's a struggle about basic principles. And I do think you're seeing the forging of a genuine solidarity. Now, of course, it's different because that's not on the ground. This is kind of very far away in the kind of the Palestine solidarity struggle around the world. So we don't really have an equivalent of that in Israel-Palestine, and it's hard to see, but that's what I would certainly hope that eventually would emerge there as well. Especially if it becomes clear that partition is not possible and that Israeli Jews and Palestinians are going to live alongside one another, that you would see one of the things I like to say is that people often ask who the Palestinian Mandela will be, and of course there have been many Palestinians who've been struggling against oppression, but to turn the question around would be to ask the question of who the Israeli Bram Fischer is. And I mentioned Bram Fischer in particular because he was not a Jew, but he was an Afrikaner who also through the Communist Party became very, very important in the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s, and who ultimately died in jail, even though his father was the prime minister of the Orange Free State, and he could have gone on to become a very important member of the Afrikaner elite. So to me, the question of who the Israeli Bram Fischer is a really crucial question to ask in terms of how this movement could emerge. In terms of I see the question, who's the Israeli de Klerk? I mean, we're not really at a point, I think, in which Israeli Jews have to think in those terms. You could say that, that there were people like Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Olmert who were willing to think about partition, but in terms of actually thinking beyond just partition, in things of thinking about a paradigm of equality, de Klerk only came to those decisions because South African elites, both business elites and ultimately political elites, saw that apartheid was no longer going to be possible, that the costs internationally and domestically were just too high. There was an uprising they couldn't put down. There was increased international isolation, which was really harming the economy. They weren't able to get bank loans from international private lending institutions. Israel is not anywhere near that point yet where someone would need to think in those terms.
Peter, in terms of so as a very young person, you're going back to South Africa. I am assuming it's likely your parents were generally of a liberal disposition. They come to America as professors. Did you feel strongly a strong disconnect with apartheid South Africa, or did you have very much awareness of it, or did that awareness grow over time? How did that happen?
Yeah, it grew over time. I mean, I think when I was quite young, I didn't have much of an awareness, but over time, I did gain that awareness. It was, I was a teenager in the mid-1980s, so this was during the state of emergency, during the anti-apartheid movement in the United States on college campuses. My parents had both in different ways been involved in anti-apartheid activism. My father had his phone wiretapped and had friends who'd been a friend who died in jail. And had been involved in pro-campus activism against apartheid. So I think that I had some sense of them as people who cared about the politics of this a lot. And so to me, I mean, I feel extremely fortunate that I was able, through the course of my life, from my childhood until my kind of early adulthood, to see apartheid ultimately end and end in a way that made South Africa, and has made South Africa, for all of its problems, because it still remains a very troubled place, a place that offers a vision of how oppression can end, or at least legal oppression can end without massive bloodshed, or at least I should say through a kind of legal process rather than through a kind of protracted war. And then that creates, I think, hope that potentially that might be able to occur in other places as well.
Peter, the South African government now has put enormous energy into this petition before the International Court of Justice. They must have had a huge team of lawyers working on it. Why have they done that? Well, I mean, there's a moral reason, but governments also do things for political reasons, practical reasons as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a popular issue in South Africa, and for the ANC, which has lost some of its popularity because of the sense of corruption and mismanagement, and is facing threats partly from more left-leaning Black parties. I think it's a way to kind of rekindle that spirit of the anti-apartheid movement, because the anti-apartheid movement the ANC did have a long-standing association with the Palestinian national movement, a kind of solidarity with it, and I think that runs very deep among South Africans who were part of the anti-apartheid movement. So I think, like with all places, there's a mix of kind of geopolitical reasons or self-interested reasons, but I think there's also a genuine sense of belief among many South Africans, including in the government, that the Palestinian cause is extremely important to them, and I would also say a resentment of the hypocrisy of the West, which talks in terms of human rights and the rules-based order, but on many issues, and in particular this one, doesn't actually apply them.
I remind people, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'll ask Grafton, have you got some questions that we can have Peter wrestle with? Grafton, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Sorry. Sorry, I was got on mute. Why do you think Biden is so intransigent on this issue? Is it fear of losing voters in the election?
I think that Biden, came of age for many decades with a kind of a template for how you handle the question of Israel politically in Washington. And that template was, you don't pick public fights with the Israeli government, partly because you may not win those fights. So those fights are going to cost you a lot politically, and they may not work out well for you. So, I mean, just to give two examples that Biden will remember, the last president who tried to condition U.S. aid to Israel was George H.W. Bush in the early 1990s. It produced a very, very tough political fight for him. And in fact, it was Bill Clinton, the Democrat, who actually criticized him from the right, saying he was too anti-Israel when Clinton won the election, defeating him in 1992. Then Barack Obama, for whom Biden was, of course, his vice president, Obama came into office wanting a settlement freeze, and then gave a speech in 2011 calling for a Palestinian state near the 67 lines. He never actually conditioned U.S. aid, but he tried to push the Netanyahu government into a place that Netanyahu didn't want to go. And Netanyahu resisted very fiercely, as he's done in the past. And Obama basically had to back down. In fact, Harry Reid, who was then the Democratic Senate leader, went to speak at AIPAC and basically threw Obama under the bus and said the United States shouldn't be dictating to Israel. So I think for Biden, who I think also probably has more of a natural affinity to Israeli Jews than to Palestinians, given that unlike Obama, he doesn't necessarily have a lot of, I think, firsthand personal experience with people who've had lived in kind of colonial kind of situations. I think the lesson for him was not to have these public fights. The problem is that that this was a case in which trying to not have the fight and trying to basically let Netanyahu do what Netanyahu was going to do, or in trying to restrain him privately, wasn't going to work, because Netanyahu wasn't interested in being restrained privately. He doesn't, among other things, if this war were to end, he might have to go to an election and lose power. But also that the scale of what Israel's doing here is just far beyond even what it's done in the past. And so I think the Biden people, I think, didn't reckon with how catastrophic this war was going to be. And I think they also didn't reckon with the fact that many people in the Democratic Party would not see things within the framework that they did, which was a framework kind of designed to give Israel a pass, and that many ordinary Democrats in the country would be revolted by America's support for this war, and then would essentially turn against Biden.
Grafton, you want to do another one?
Thank you. Could you make some comparisons between apartheid in South Africa and in Israel-Palestine? Where would you say it's more oppressive, or what are the different characteristics in the two cases?
So in both cases, you have a system of group supremacy. In the case of South Africa for white South Africans, in the case of Israel-Palestine for Jews. There are, in both cases, you have a kind of segmentation, a kind of fragmentation of the population that's legally inferior. So Black South Africans were kind of fragmented into these, pushed into these what are called homelands, these Bantustans, pushed out of the urban areas and only allowed to come into urban areas to work. In Israel, Palestine, you have Palestinians kind of pushed first during the Nakba 1948 away from their homes into, for instance, Gaza, which is very heavily overcrowded because it has so many refugees from 1948 there, and then fragmented more, for instance, within the West Bank, as Israel kind of controls most of the area, most of the territory in the West Bank, what's called Area C, and Palestinians live in kind of an archipelago of cities and towns in the rest of the West Bank. So you see that system of fragmentation. There are some of the Palestinians under Israeli control, the citizens who are sometimes called Arab Israelis, can vote, which is different than apartheid South Africa, where you didn't have a system for Black South Africans to be able to vote in national elections. But most Palestinians can't vote, and even the Palestinian citizens who can vote are still not kind of full members of the political system in a variety of ways. I think the differences, there are important differences. One important difference was that apartheid South Africa was very dependent on Black labor to run the economy. And I think that ultimately turned out to be a key point of weakness, because one of the really key kind of elements of the domestic anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s was this network of labor unions known as COSATU, which launched big labor strikes. In fact, Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa, was the head of the National Union of Mine Workers, which is a very, very powerful force in the anti-apartheid movement. That gave Black South Africans a leverage that Palestinians don't have, because although there are Palestinians who work either inside Israel or who work in settlements, the Israeli economy is not nearly as dependent on Palestinian labor as white South Africans, as the apartheid South Africa was on Black labor. In fact, Zionism has kind of always had this ethos of kind of not being dependent as much on Palestinian labor. And so I think that's one kind of leverage point that Palestinians don't have that Black South Africans did have.
Another point that maybe sound a little bit silly, but I think it's important, is that in South Africa, it was called apartheid. That's what they called it, and they defended it. They said, this is a good idea, where Israel said, no, it's not apartheid. And I think that has a very important ramifications for how we tackle it.
Yes, that's true. You're right. That as you say, apartheid was the official name. You know, sometimes the South Africans were trying to use more euphemistic terms like separate development, for instance. But you're right that the South African, I would say, kind of propaganda or kind of rhetorical defense system they had was a lot more primitive than Israel-Palestine. I mean, they would say that the ANC were communists, which was not entirely wrong. I mean, there was a strong alliance between the South African Communist Party and the ANC was getting weapons from the Eastern Bloc, including the Soviet Union. So they would say that, and they would call them terrorists. That is kind of somewhat similar to Israel-Palestine. But South Africa was I would say, a more was a more primitive political system than Israel-Palestine, much less globally connected into the world, much less sophisticated. So yes, I think, and Israel is also just much more, I think, valuable to not just the United States, but to many countries around the world because of its technological and economic dynamism, because of its military exports, its surveillance industry. And so that makes, I think, it a more powerful actor, which is harder to isolate.
Grafton, another one?
Thank you. Yes. Can you comment on the role of AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and similar right-wing Jewish groups in the United States?
Sure. So AIPAC is a lobbying organization that really it really becomes powerful in the 1980s. There are a series of other American Jewish organizations that have influence before that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, like the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress. But those organizations are liberal on domestic issues, which means that so what happens is that when Ronald Reagan wins in 1980, and Republicans, basically conservative Republicans, really take power in Washington for the first time, those traditional American Jewish organizations don't have a lot of influence within a Republican administration. And what AIPAC's strength is that it's bipartisan because it takes no positions on any domestic issues. It doesn't alienate anybody from the most, from right to left on domestic issues like abortion or whatever. It just concentrates on basically trying to make sure that both Democrats and Republicans support unconditionally support Israel. And so AIPAC is a very kind of savvy strategy, which is they recognize that American politics is very dependent on money, but not just money. It's very dependent on relationships. The relationships often are connected to money. But so what AIPAC does is it goes out and finds supporters and creates communities of supporters all across the United States, especially and encourages those people to develop relationships with their local members of Congress. And often through fundraising, but they start often with politicians who are at a very early stage in their career. And then those politicians may move on to becoming more important. And those politicians have often developed very strong relationships with local people who are AIPAC activists. And there's the kind of network of those people all across the country. And that has given AIPAC a lot of influence, especially because there's not been really much of a counterweight. There's not really been a significant, kind of pro-Palestine or Arab or Muslim kind of organization that has had a lot of influence in Congress. And also because I think there is among some group of American politicians, especially Republicans, a kind of a natural inclination to support Israel because Israel's founding myths are very similar to America's founding myths, a kind of a promised land forged on a hostile frontier. So especially for people who are more on the right side of the political spectrum, because of the way they see the United States, they actually admire Israel seeing Israel almost as a kind of a model of what they would like the United States to be. And so there's been a kind of ideological basis of support that AIPAC has been able to play on. In fact, an organization that's even bigger than AIPAC is Christians United for Israel, which is even more explicit about that kind of ideological and religious connection between Israel and the United States.
Peter, in the demonstrations we've seen in Colombia, they're mostly white kids. There was a time, some time ago, when there was some kind of identification being made with Black Lives Matter, identifying with the Palestinian struggle and so on. That's not so obvious in the current. I'm thinking of South Africa, the identification of black as a black-white issue. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that was another strength that the anti-apartheid movement had in the United States, was that it had a strong base in the Black community. The Congressional Black Caucus was very, very, really at the heart of pushing for sanctions. And they were becoming, they were an important force inside the Democratic Party. You don't really quite have an equivalent because, let's say, Palestinian or Arab or Muslim Americans don't have anywhere near the influence in the Democratic Party that Black Americans had in the 1980s. Partly, I think the kind of Islamophobia since September 11th has made it harder for Arab and Muslim Americans to kind of gain a foothold, even inside the Democratic Party, let alone the Republican Party. But that said, I think if you look at the activist movements that are growing on the ground on college campuses, you do see that Black Americans are well represented, and I think a lot of people of color are well represented. I think that there are white activists as well, but on some of the campuses where I've spoken, the Jewish students have told me that they actually feel like they represent a majority of the white students. I mean, not all Jews are white, but many are. They represent a majority of the kind of white student activists, and then a lot of the other student activists are from various different groups of people of color.
Mm. Grafton, another one?
Yes. I think you've already touched on this a little bit, but if you'd like to expand on your answer, please, you're welcome to. At this point, Biden has lost the confidence of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, yet the only other option is Trump. What do you see playing out if Trump is in fact elected? What do you see playing out in terms of Israel-Palestine if Trump is in fact elected?
I think Trump himself is somewhat unpredictable in some way, and also tends to see things in very personal ways. So he's supposedly unhappy with Benjamin Netanyahu because Benjamin Netanyahu kind of congratulated Joe Biden on winning the election. By Trump himself, you can't never entirely predict what he's going to do. But I think if you look at Trump's policies on Israel-Palestine in his first administration, what you see is that the people that he brought in to make these policies, Jason Greenblatt, David Friedman, his his ambassador to Israel, Jared Kushner, regardless of Trump's somewhat erratic views, and I think the fact that actually Trump didn't like Netanyahu very much, didn't ultimately matter that much. I think because the people he had around him were pushing in a particular way, and I would guess that those folks would push in that direction again. And what that I think would mean would be the support for Israel moving to continuing the war, making Gaza, continuing to make Gaza uninhabitable for Palestinians, and perhaps pushing towards mass expulsion by pushing for Egypt to open the border at Rafah. David Friedman has already said that he's publicly that the Palestinians should go to Egypt. Nikki Haley, who could, conceivably be Trump's Secretary of State, one might imagine, has also said the Palestinians in Gaza should leave. So I think that, and I don't think Trump will face the same kind of pressure from his base and from Republicans in Congress that Biden does. So I think that Trump's policies, I know it may be hard for folks to imagine, but I actually think Trump's policies would be worse.
Mm. Peter, there's something, development that I've just a little bit aware of, and you may have followed it. In Congress, there is some movement to punish South Africa for its intervention at the International Court of Justice. I don't know whether it has any legs or not. Are you aware of what I'm talking about?
I've seen some reference to that. I don't know the details of it though.
Okay, all right. What I've read is that there's some motion in Congress by some Republicans saying that this is disgraceful what the South Africa is doing. It's anti-Semitic, and furthermore, South Africa is lining up with Russia and China and America's enemies, and we should condition our trade with South Africa. That's all I've read, and I don't know anything more about that.
Right.
Grafton?
Can you talk a little bit about what's going on in the West Bank with the armed settlers attacking Palestinians? Some people might call it a pogrom. I don't know if you would use that term. Can the U.S. or should the U.S. do more to demand that Israel address the situation?
Yes, I mean, I do think there has been a big increase in settler violence, which is, not surprising given the nature of this Israeli government, which is, has people in important positions who, really themselves are, very much part of that kind of radical settler movement. The Biden administration is kind of, it's funny because the Biden administration, I think, doesn't want to condition aid or impose sanctions on Gaza. They've kind of started to talk about doing certain things in the West Bank. So they did impose sanctions on a couple of settlers, and now there's talk that they might restrict U.S. aid to a unit that has committed human rights abuses in the West Bank, a unit of the Israeli military called Netzeh Yehuda. But it would take a really dramatic change in U.S. policy for the U.S. to actually start doing something about this. I mean, it would really take a much more fundamental shift away from unconditional U.S. support, away from maintaining Israeli impunity in international organizations, in order to potentially make the kind of change in Israeli politics that would lead a different kind of Israeli government to act on this. Settlers in general in Israel are often deeply intertwined with the security state itself. And they're also citizens of the country. So they're always going to have, be treated with kid gloves compared to Palestinians who aren't citizens and live under military law. So unfortunately, I don't see much of a likelihood of that changing in the short term. There could be an uprising in the West Bank, because life is getting so unbearable for Palestinians, and perhaps because this might be an area where Hamas or Islamic Jihad or other groups, kind of want to try to take Israel on. So that would create a whole new dynamic. But I don't, unfortunately, see much likelihood of restraining this kind of violence in the short term.
It's hard. I mean, I've heard people talk about a potential an uprising in the West Bank, but you have to have arms. You have to have equipment. I mean, they have some, but it's nothing like what Hamas had. I worry about that scenario. I don't look forward to it with enthusiasm.
No, certainly not. I mean, there in the first Intifada, there was an uprising that was largely unarmed, but it took a level of organization that I think might be hard to replicate now.
Grafton?
One of our listeners is wondering about use of terminology. Words like apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing. Which of these terms do you feel is the most accurate, and which do you feel are unhelpful? How should one use these words?
I think so. Apartheid, is now a term that has been applied. That has been applied to Israel by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, as well as B'Tselem and Yesh Din, which are two of Israel's most prominent human rights organizations. In addition, of course, to Palestinians who've been using this word for a long time. So I think that you're getting to something like kind of international human rights consensus on the use of this term, and certainly in the West Bank, if not in all of Israel, Palestine. On the question of ethnic cleansing, I don't think that I wouldn't see that term as particularly controversial if you're referring to Israel's expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. Maybe not all of those Palestinians were expelled. Some fled in fear, but most were expelled. The large majority of them were expelled. And so if you're expelling people on an ethnic basis, I think that counts as ethnic cleansing. There was another significant expulsion in 1967, and there have been smaller scale expulsions since, and we may indeed be in the midst of one now, depending on how things play out in Gaza. So, so I don't particularly find much that's controversial in that term either. On the question on genocide, I think there you don't have the same consensus among human rights organizations that that you do on the term apartheid, at least not at this point. I think you do have prominent international legal scholars who do term it genocide. And then the International Criminal Court has said that it's plausible that it could be genocide, and they are basically going to take probably years more to actually come to a final conclusion. Now, some people might say that's a problem with the entire notion of genocide, which is essentially you can kind of spot it in retrospect, but it's hard to kind of label it as such as it's going on, which is, I think, part of the reason that some of these international lawyers have called it genocide. To me, I think it's I don't have any, to me, the question is, as with any of these terms, I think what's useful is if you're going to use the term to define what you mean by it. So, for instance, one thing I hear a lot when people use the term genocide is, well, how can it be genocide? They haven't killed all the Palestinians or haven't killed all the Palestinians in Gaza, right? So often there's a kind of popular notion of genocide, which is at odds with what the international legal definition of genocide is. Just like some people might respond to the term apartheid and saying, well, that's the system they had in South Africa. the system in Israel-Palestine is not exactly the same as that. And I think it's important, whatever terms you're using, to actually define what you mean by them so you can establish kind of what kind of argument you're making.
Peter, what are your contacts now? Would you be allowed to go to Israel now? And what is the state of do you have ongoing daily conversations with Jews in Israel? How are you able to keep up on what Israeli Jews are thinking?
Yes, I mean, I do have still a lot of relationships and talks and talk to people. I think that the people who I talk to are not generally representative in their opinions of Israeli Jews as a whole. Israeli Jewish kind of public opinion has moved even further to the right since October 7th. Even though people are soured on Netanyahu, they've moved further to the right. So I have relationships with folks who have those kind of views as well, but those are more challenging because of how large the political gulf is between us, and especially because I think the mood in Israel has been so inflamed and traumatized since October 7th. But for me, it's very important to maintain relationships with people there. This is a society that I feel very connected to, that I really feel at home in many ways, and that I identify with very strongly, even as I feel like the state is fundamentally oppressive, and I oppose the idea of Jewish supremacy behind the state. And that may be perhaps may sound strange for people, but for me, it's not. I know many Jews around the world who would be opposed to the idea of a state based on Jewish supremacy, but feel a kind of strong sense of identification and a connection to the place where almost half of the Jews on earth live. If you have a sense of caring about a sense of identification and solidarity with other Jews, it's very difficult to just say those people are not of concern to you.
Peter, I think one of your great strengths from my perspective has been that you maintained a very principled position, but without minimizing the antagonism. You've struggled hard to maintain conversations with particularly other Jews who have that attachment to Israel. You are well known here for having written a number of articles in the New York Times. The one that struck me most was why I no longer believe in a Jewish state. I mean, I may not have the title there exactly, but one of the things I didn't understand. Do you think? I assume you still hold that position, but is that because you like the idea of a Jewish state, but you don't think it will work, or do you think that the idea from the beginning was ill-founded? What's your thinking on that?
I think the idea is ill-founded. That wasn't what I always believed, but it's kind of what I've come to believe. It's important to me that there is a kind of thriving Jewish presence in Israel-Palestine, a Jewish culture, even you might say a Jewish society that can maintain Hebrew as a living language, do some of the kind of cultural production that you see coming out of Israel, which is very, very important to me. But I think that the problem with I don't believe in the idea of states that are built on the legal supremacy of one ethnic or religious group. I think that such states are, I think that, first of all, it's not coherent to be arguing against the principle of kind of ethno-nationalism in the United States if one supports that principle in Israel-Palestine. And indeed, because the kind of the ethno-nationalist principle that Israel is based on is actually now in some ways in a kind of partnership with ethno-nationalist movements in many places, in Europe, in India, for instance, in the United States. And I also think that, so I think people as a fundamental principle deserve to be treated equally under the law. I mean, there will never be perfect equality in practice in any place, but I think the goal should at least be equality under the law between people of different identities. And when you have a state that's based on group supremacy, you need to do you have to do a whole series of things that seem to me just fundamentally violate the principles of liberal democracy, right? So Israel, to be a Jewish state, Israel has to maintain an overwhelming majority of its voters being Jewish. So then you either have to deny many of the Palestinians under your control the right to vote, right? Or if the Palestinians do gain citizenship, if their numbers start to grow and they stop being 20%, but start to get to 30 or 40%, then you have to rejigger things some other way, because your fundamental principle is not that all people are equal under the law and equal citizens, but your fundamental principle is that people of a particular identity are going to rule.
Peter, we're getting near the end of our time here. I do recommend to anybody who's interested to check out that the Substack link that Grafton put on, and I'll put it in a follow-up email. Peter, amongst his many activities, every Friday noon he chairs a session where he brings in terrific guests, some of whom he agrees with, some of whom he doesn't, and manages much better than I do a conversation amongst them. And it's open to everyone, although the bulk of the participants are, I would say, American Jews, and mostly senior people closer to my age than Peter. Peter's somewhere between Peter's age and mine, but very thoughtful people who have a lot of experience and so on. I find it a fascinating look into liberal American Jewish thought, and I highly recommend it to everyone. Grafton, thank you very much for curating the questions. I see there were still some questions that, yes, you do have to pay to Peter's Substack. I can't remember what it is, but there is a fee for it. But
there's a free version. There's a free version, and then there's a paid version, so you can choose.
He tells the truth in the paid version. And Peter, this has been delightful. I thank you so much for. I admire you for your principle. I admire you for your articulation, for remembering what happened in 1968 when I don't remember it very well. Peter, thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening, and thanks everybody else for tuning in. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.